A mafia empire was ready to trade her like a bargaining chip, but Luca said one word, no, not because Claire belonged to him, not because he wanted to look noble, because she was a person and people are not objects for negotiation. This is a story about dignity, moral courage, and the moment power finally learns restraint. Like, share, comment, and subscribe if you want more stories like this.
The South Side doesn't smell like TV hospitals. TV hospitals smell like drama. Clean drama. The kind where everyone's scrubs are pressed and the lighting is soft. And the doctors always say the right thing at the right moment. St. Emmanuel smells like bleach trying to cover up something bleach can't cover. It smells like the vending machine coffee that nobody drinks but everybody buys. It smells like a Friday night that went wrong for about 40 different people. All of them sitting in the same waiting room, all of them wondering why it's taking so long. I'd been on shift for 14 hours. My feet stopped hurting around hour 10, which I've learned is not a good sign. That's not relief. That's your body giving up on the complaint. I was handing off my last chart when Jade grabbed my arm. Jade doesn't grab your arm unless it's worth grabbing. Bay 7, she said. 3 suits. Security's been keeping everyone out for 40 minutes. Okafor took one look and said he didn't have the she made air quotes relevant expertise. I knew what that meant. Okafor had 15 years of emergency medicine. He had expertise in plenty. What he didn't have was an appetite for whatever was behind that curtain. I picked up a supply tray and went. I knocked twice on the metal frame. Didn't wait long. Pulled the curtain back. There were 3 men in a space meant for one patient. 2 of them were built like they'd been assembled from parts that were ordered specifically for standing in doorways and making people uncomfortable. Black suits. The kind of stillness that isn't relaxed, it's trained. The 3rd man was sitting on the edge of the gurney. He wasn't leaning, wasn't gripping the rails. Just sitting there, back straight, one hand pressed flat against his right side where his white shirt had gone dark and wet. His jacket was folded beside him like he'd taken it off carefully and set it down neatly, which, given the circumstances, was one of the stranger things I'd seen all night. He looked at me the way people look at something they're deciding about. I asked for a doctor, he said. Low voice. Slight accent I couldn't place right away. And I'm asking you to lie down before you pass out, I said. You want to keep arguing, or do you want to stop bleeding? One of the suits stepped toward me. Not quickly. Just the slow, deliberate kind of step that's meant to make you back up. I didn't back up. I turned and looked at him directly. You're bigger than me. You might be armed. I'm going to assume you are. I kept my voice even. But this is my ER. And in this room, every single person gets treated the same, including your boss over there, who is currently bleeding through a $400 shirt. If you get between me and my patient one more time, I walk out, and you can explain to him why I left. The man in the suit didn't move, but the older one standing closer to the door, quieter than the others, watching everything, made a small gesture with 2 fingers. The suit stepped back. I turned to my patient. Thank you for waiting. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Close enough. The wound was a laceration along the lower ribs. Clean entry. No jagged edges. Knife, not glass. About 11 centimeters. Deep enough to need suturing. Not deep enough to have touched anything critical. I'd seen worse on a Tuesday. I worked without talking much. That's not coldness. That's focus. But I noticed things. I always notice things. Old scarring on his chest. The kind that comes from something that was never properly treated. A surgical line on his right shoulder done by someone who knew what they were doing. And his hands, both of them still, completely still, even when I pressed into the wound to irrigate it. You've been hurt worse than this before, I said, many times. And you still haven't figured out how to stop getting hurt. He was quiet for a second. No, it wasn't defensive. It was just honest. I respected that. While I threaded the suture needle, Marco, I didn't know his name yet, but that's what I'll call him, took a quiet phone call near the window. I wasn't trying to listen, but in a space that small, you hear things. A woman's voice on the other end, older, anxious in the way that's been going on long enough to become a permanent condition. And my patient, the man with the pressed jacket, and the trained stillness, and the hands that didn't shake, said something that surprised me. His voice changed, just slightly, dropped its edge. I'm fine. Tell her I'm fine. I kept my eyes on the sutures. 16, 17. Tie off. He was someone's person. Whatever else he was that. He stood when I finished, moved carefully but fluidly, the way people do when they've had a lot of practice hurting and not showing it. Marco set an envelope on the counter. Thick. The kind of thick that has a specific weight to it. That's $15,000, my patient said. I slid it back. I don't take money from patients. It's more than 6 months of your salary. I know what it is. I pulled off my gloves. My answer's the same. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his jacket. At the curtain, he stopped. Didn't turn around. Just stopped. My name is Claire Hayes, I said. I work out of this ER. If you have complications, don't send someone else. Come yourself. He didn't answer, but he stood there for 1 beat longer than he needed to before he walked out. I looked at the envelope he'd left sitting on the counter. I looked at the clock, 3:12 a.m. This was supposed to be my last patient of the night. I slept 4 hours and woke up thinking about his hands, not in a romantic way, in a clinical way. The way you replay something after a shift when your brain won't let it go. The stillness of them, the scars, the way he'd pressed his palm flat against his own wound like he'd done it before, and knew exactly how much pressure to apply. People who've been hurt that many times usually fall into one of two categories. They either become very loud about pain, or they become very quiet. He was the second kind. The quiet kind is harder to read. The quiet kind is also, in my experience, the kind you should pay more attention to. I made coffee, stood at my kitchen window, watched the street below. There was a black Escalade parked across from my building. It had been there when I got home. It was still there now. I watched it for a while. It didn't move. Nobody got in or out. I finished my coffee and went to work. Jade was waiting for me at the locker room. Someone came by yesterday, she said, before I'd even gotten my bag open. After your shift, asking about you at the front desk. Not a cop. Cops have a specific way of standing, you know. This was different. Suit. Older guy. Very polite. Very careful about what he said. What did he want? He asked what time you usually finish your shift. She crossed her arms. I told him I had no idea who he was talking about, and then I called building security. Good. Claire. I know. Do you? I did. I knew exactly what it meant. And I was already deciding how I felt about it before I'd had time to figure out how I actually felt about it. That's a habit I'm working on. The older man, the one from Bay 7, the one who'd made the two-finger gesture that moved a wall of muscle out of my way, was standing outside the staff entrance at noon. He was alone. No suits flanking him, just him in a gray overcoat, hands in his pockets, looking like someone who'd been waiting a while and didn't mind. Ms. Hayes, he said, you're the one who came by yesterday. I am. My name is Marco. He said it simply, like it was enough information. Mr. Montano's wound is infected. Fever of 103. His usual physician is overseas and can't return in time. The man covering for him is, he paused, choosing his words, it's not someone Mr. Montano will allow near him right now. He can come to the ER. He can't. He can go to any urgent care in the city. Miss Hayes. Marco looked at me steadily, not threatening, not performing patience, actually patient. I'm asking for your help. I'm not here to tell you what's going to happen. I'm here to ask. There's a difference. Most people don't make it. I noticed that he did. Give me a minute, I said. I stood by the window in the break room for that minute, thought about the envelope I'd pushed back across the counter, thought about the Escalade outside my building, thought about a man who'd changed his voice on the phone for someone who was worried about him, thought about the infection. 103 is not nothing. Left alone, with no treatment, no fluids, no proper antibiotics, it moves fast. It moves toward places you don't want it to go. I went back outside. I'll go, I said. But first you're going to listen to 3 things, not negotiate. Listen. Marco nodded. 1. I will not be blindfolded, covered, or prevented from seeing where I'm going. I am a free person. I have the right to know my own location. That's not up for discussion. He didn't flinch. 2. I can leave whenever I decide to leave, not whenever I'm told I can. Whenever I decide. Understood. 3. Inside that house, I take direction from my own training and my own conscience. Not from you, not from him, not from anyone else. The moment someone tries to override a medical decision I've made, I stop working and I leave. Those are my terms. Do we have an agreement or not? Marco was quiet for a moment, just a moment. I'll need to relay these to Mr. Montano. Then go relay them. He made a phone call, spoke quietly in Italian, listened. Then he looked back at me and said, he agrees to all three. I picked up my bag. Then let's go. No blindfold. He'd honored the first condition before I'd even gotten in the car. It was a black SUV, clean, quiet. Marco sat in the front. I sat in the back, with my medical bag, and watched the city turn into suburbs, turn into something quieter and larger, and set back from the road. 40 minutes, roughly. North and slightly east. Lake Michigan eventually visible through the trees. I memorized the route, not because I was planning to run, because knowing where you are is a basic human right. And I'd spent enough of my life in places where people tried to take that away quietly, with good intentions, telling you it was for your own safety to know exactly how it felt and exactly what it meant. It means we don't fully trust you with this information. I trust everyone with the information of where they are. That's not a philosophical position. That's just decency. The estate was bigger than I expected, set behind a long private drive, surrounded by trees that had been there longer than the house. The house itself was stone and glass, 3 stories, the kind of place that had been lived in and added to over decades rather than designed all at once. I noticed the men on the grounds, counted 8 visible ones from the driveway. Probably more I couldn't see. Marco led me inside without ceremony, through a foyer that was grand without trying to be, down a hallway lined with framed photographs, families, groups, landscapes, and up a staircase to the second floor. He knocked on a set of double doors, opened them without waiting for a response. Luca Montano was seated behind a desk, not lying down, not resting, seated, jacket on, collar buttoned, a laptop open in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, and the only sign that anything was wrong was the slight tension around his jaw and the fact that he was holding himself very carefully, still. Performance of strength. I seize it all the time. It means something different depending on who's doing it. Here, I thought it meant, I don't want to be seen as weak in front of someone new. I understood that. Didn't mean I was going to work around it. You're sitting upright, so I'll think you're not struggling, I said. That's good for your confidence and terrible for your wound. Which do you want to prioritize? Marco made a sound behind me that was not quite a laugh. Luca looked at me for a long moment. The desk seemed more appropriate for a first conversation. We're not having a first conversation. We're having a medical assessment. Lie down or sit on the bed. Your choice, but pick one. He moved to the bed, slowly, carefully, and with the controlled effort of someone pretending it wasn't effort. He sat on the edge of it, and I moved toward him with my bag. I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing before I do it, I said, opening the bag. And I need your agreement at each step. Your body, your decisions. I'm just the one with the instruments. He looked at me with something I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion. Something more like adjustment. Like he was recalibrating. No one speaks to me that way, he said. What way? Like I'm he stopped. Chose a different word than the first one he'd reached for. Like I'm a regular person. You are a regular person. You have a bacterial infection and a fever of 103. And if we don't get ahead of it, you're going to be a regular person in a lot of trouble. I pulled on my gloves. Now, can I see the wound? It was worse than I'd hoped, better than I'd feared. The original sutures had held, but the tissue around them was angry red, swollen, warm to the touch in a way that meant the infection had been building for at least 36 hours, probably longer. He'd pushed through it. Of course he had. I removed the dressing, cleaned the site, and started talking through what I was seeing, not for his benefit exactly, for both of ours. When I narrate out loud, I think better. And it meant he knew what was happening to his own body, which I believe matters whether you're in a hospital room or a private estate or anywhere in between. Everyone deserves to understand what's being done to them and why. That's not a medical principle, that's a human one. The infection needs IV antibiotics, I said. I'm going to place a line, run fluids, because you're dehydrated on top of everything else, and I want to keep the wound open for now. rather than close it again. It needs to drain. I'll pack it with antibiotic gauze and dress it, and we reassess in 12 hours. Any questions? No. Do I have your consent to proceed? He paused on that. Like the word itself was unfamiliar in this context. Yes, I worked for about an hour. He didn't talk much, neither did I. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in when someone is in pain and choosing not to show it, and you're choosing not to make them show it. It's not uncomfortable. It's almost respectful. At some point, Rosa appeared. I didn't know her name yet, but she came in without knocking, carrying a bowl of something that smelled like it had been on the stove all day. And she set it on the nightstand without a word and turned to leave, and then she stopped. She looked at me, not the way people look at someone they're suspicious of, the way people look at someone they recognize. Hayes, she said, almost to herself. You're Maya Hayes's daughter. I kept my hands steady on the IV line. You knew my mother. She looked at Luca. He looked at the window. And something passed through the room, quiet and heavy. The specific weight of a thing that has been sitting unspoken for a long time. We'll talk, Rosa said to me, gently, like a promise. Then she left. I finished placing the line, checked the flow, adjusted the tape. Luca's eyes were on the ceiling. You want to tell me what that was about? I asked. No. Okay, I stood, pulled off my gloves. Your fever should start dropping within a few hours. I'll check back at stay. He said it before I'd finished. Then, like he heard himself, there may be complications. It's better if someone with medical training is on the premises. I looked at him. He looked back at me. We both knew that wasn't entirely what he meant, and we both let it stand for now. I'll stay through the night, I said. I'll check your vitals every 2 hours, and I'm calling my colleague at 8 tomorrow morning. That's not negotiable. Understood. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. Then I stopped, because something was still sitting in the room with me that I needed to say out loud. Mr. Montano, whatever Rosa knows about my mother, I want to hear it. Not tonight, but I want to hear it. He didn't answer right away. I know, he finally said. I went to find Rosa and ask her where I'd be sleeping. I woke up at 6 because I always wake up at 6. 14 years of early shifts will do that to a person. Your body just stops asking for permission. The guest room was larger than my apartment. I'm not exaggerating. There was a sitting area, an actual sitting area with 2 chairs and a lamp, and a small table with a glass of water on it that someone had placed there at some point while I was asleep, which was either thoughtful or unsettling. And I decided to call it thoughtful because I needed to function. I dressed, checked my phone, no signal, which I'd expected, and went to look in on Luca before I did anything else. His fever had dropped to 100.4. The wound looked better. He was asleep, finally, lying on his back with one arm across his stomach, and he looked, I don't know, younger. People always look younger when they're not performing anything. I stood there for about 30 seconds doing my assessment. Then I went to find coffee. Rosa was already in the kitchen. The kitchen was warm. That sounds simple, but it meant something. The rest of the house ran cool and precise marble, clean lines, everything in the right place. The kitchen was different, herbs hanging from a rack near the window, a pot on the stove that had been there since before I woke up, a radio on the counter playing something quiet and Italian that I didn't recognize. Rosa looked up when I came in and pointed at the coffee maker without being asked. I poured a cup and sat down at the table without being invited. That felt right somehow. This was her room. You don't wait for a formal invitation in someone's kitchen. You just sit down. We were quiet for a few minutes, just the coffee and the radio and the morning light coming through the window over the sink. Then Rosa said, Your mother volunteered at a clinic in back of the yards about 20 years ago. She did, I said. I was 9. She used to take me with her on Saturdays sometimes. I know. She brought you once in the summer. You sat in the waiting room and read the same magazine 3 times because there wasn't anything else. I looked at her. You were there. I drove supplies sometimes. Back then. She turned to the stove, adjusted something that didn't need adjusting. The clinic was funded anonymously. Your mother never knew who was paying for it. I waited. Antonio Montano paid for it, Rosa said. Luca's father. He funded 3 clinics in neighborhoods that were part of his territory. Not because he was generous. Because healthy communities are quieter communities, and quieter communities caused him fewer problems. She said it plainly. No attempt to make it prettier than it was. But the good it did was real. whatever his reasons. I held my coffee cup with both hands, thought about my mother hauling boxes of supplies every Saturday morning. Thought about the woman who came in with the cut on her arm that healed clean because the antibiotics were stocked. Thought about the man who was asleep upstairs. Does Luca know about this? I asked. He knows his father funded those clinics. He never knew your mother worked at one. She paused. I recognized your last name last night. I don't think it's an accident, but I also don't think it's a plan. Some things are just what they are. I didn't know what to do with that, so I filed it and left it alone. How long have you worked for this family? I asked. 41 years. She said it without drama. Just a fact. I worked for Antonio. Now I work for Luca. I cook. I run the house. And sometimes I tell him things he needs to hear that no one else will say. She finally sat down across from me. That last part I do for free. Luca was awake by 9 and asking to sit up. I told him he could sit up in bed. He negotiated for the chair by the window. I said fine, but only if he let me check the dressing first, and only if he agreed to lie back down if his blood pressure dropped. He agreed. He sat in the chair. He looked out at the grounds below the lake in the distance, the men still moving along the perimeter. And I changed his bandage and didn't say anything for a while. Why South Side? He asked. I taped the last edge of the dressing. Why not? You could work anywhere. Hospital like this, he gestured vaguely, meaning the estate, meaning money, meaning the world where people can pay for good care, would pay you well. You mean a private hospital? Yes. With patients who have good insurance and stable housing and access to follow-up care, generally. I sat back in my chair. The people I see at St. Emmanuel don't have those things. They come in for something small that got big, because they waited too long, because they couldn't afford not to wait. They come in once, and then you never see them again because they can't take a second day off work for a follow-up appointment. I paused. I'm not there because I couldn't get a job somewhere else. I'm there because I can't figure out a reason to be anywhere else. Luca was quiet. That distinction matters, I said. Between where you want to be and where you're actually needed. A lot of people with resources never have to think about it. They just go where's comfortable and call it a good life. You're talking about me. I'm talking about myself. I looked at him. But if it fits, it fits. He turned back to the window. Outside, a man in a dark jacket crossed the lawn below. Then another. Then 3 more. There are more of them this morning, I said. Yes. Something happened last night. Yes. I waited to see if he'd offer more. He didn't. That was fine. I wasn't his confidant. I was his nurse. There's a difference. And I believe in keeping it clear. Marco came in around 11 with the particular face of someone carrying information they don't want to carry. He spoke to Luca in Italian. Low, fast, not meant for me. I was on the other side of the room, reorganizing my supply bag, which is what I do when I'm not supposed to be listening, but want to be available if something turns medical. The conversation was short. Whatever Marco said, Luca's jaw tightened once and then went still. Marco looked at me briefly, nodded the polite, careful nod of a man who remembered our agreement and left. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, you need to stay tonight. I set down the bag. I'm already staying tonight. We talked about this. He stopped, started again. The situation outside has become more complicated. It involves you now. Involves me how? Someone who wants access to me has learned that you're here. He said it directly, which I respected even though the content of it was alarming. That makes you a point of leverage. As long as you're inside this property, you're protected. Outside, he didn't finish. I looked at him for a long moment. Not safe because of who? He held my gaze. Because of me. I thought about that. About what it meant that someone would use me a nurse hearse they'd never met to get to a man I'd known for less than 48 hours. About how quickly a single decision, made at the end of a long shift, could ripple into something like this. Then I thought about the fact that he'd told me, directly, without softening it, that mattered. I need to call Jade, I said. I know. I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled up a video call. Luca watched me do it, and didn't say a word. Jade answered on the second ring. I could see the ER behind her, the familiar controlled chaos of a Friday morning, the board full of patient names, the particular fluorescent light that made everyone look a little worse than they felt. Something in my chest loosened at the sight of it. You okay? Jade said. reading my face before I'd said anything. I'm okay, extended situation. I'm outside the city. I kept my voice steady. I need you to write down an address. I read it off from memory. Lucas said nothing. Jade, call me at 8 tomorrow morning. If I don't pick up, give that address to the police. Don't wait. Don't text first. Just call. Claire, I mean it. And I love you. Talk tomorrow. I closed the laptop. The room was quiet. Luca hadn't moved. You memorized the route, he said. Of course I did. I told Marco no blindfold. I know. I still memorized it. Because knowing where you are is something you should always be able to do for yourself. I looked at him. That's not distrust. That's just not giving away something that belongs to you. He considered that for a long moment. I didn't try to stop you, he said. About the phone call. About Jade. About the address. I know you didn't. I picked up my bag and stood. That's the first thing you've done, since I got here, that I didn't have to ask for. I went to check his IV line and let that sit where I'd put it. Outside the window, the sun was starting its drop toward the lake. More men had appeared on the grounds. I could count at least 20 from where I stood. Whatever was coming, it was coming from outside these walls. But in this room, right now, the temperature was still manageable. Get some rest, I said. Your body needs it more than your pride does. He lay back against the pillow without arguing. That was progress. I learned to sleep light when I was 12 years old, the year my father died. The neighborhood changed, or maybe I just started hearing it differently. Either way, I stopped sleeping through things. I started waking up for sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps on the wrong part of the stairs. A car slowing down when cars don't usually slow down. 14 years later, it's still the first thing that wakes me. Not the footsteps this time. The radios, multiple voices at once, overlapping. The kind of coordinated chatter that only happens when people are moving fast and need to know where everyone else is. I was at the window before I was fully conscious, looking down at the grounds. Floodlights, more of them than before, cutting across the lawn in wide, sweeping arcs. Men moving in clusters, not panicked, but urgent. The kind of fast that has a plan behind it. I counted, stopped at 22, and figured there were more I couldn't see. A knock at my door, quick and professional. Miss Hayes, Theo's voice. Please stay inside. There's a minor situation outside. I opened the door. He was standing in the hallway in the particular way of someone who was trying to look calm and succeeding at about 40% of it. Your definition of minor involves 20 plus people with radios. We have it handled. Is Luca okay? Mr. Montano is currently. I was already past him. He was in the study at the end of the hall, standing, not sitting, phone in one hand. A man I hadn't seen before was across from him, speaking fast and low. Two other men flanked the door from the inside. Luca looked up when I came in. Something moved across his face, not irritation, almost relief, which he covered quickly. You need to go back to your room, he said. Your wound is still open and draining. If you're physically active right now, the packing could shift, and we'd be starting over. I need to know if you're about to leave the building. The man I didn't recognize stepped toward me, not fast. The slow, deliberate kind of step designed to communicate something without saying it. His name was Nico. I found that out later. What I knew in that moment was the move. I'd seen it before, in different settings, different rooms. It always meant the same thing. You don't matter enough here to take up space. I'd been told that in a lot of different ways over the years, quietly, loudly, with words and without them, by hospital administrators, by attendings who looked past me to find the doctor, by people who saw my face and my scrubs and made a fast calculation about what kind of person I was. I was tired of accommodating that calculation. I turned and faced him directly. I understand you want me to move. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The posture said it. I'm not going to, I said. Because I'm here to do a job that affects whether or not your employer's infection spreads into his bloodstream, and standing here blocking the doorway at 2 in the morning is how you explain to him later why his nurse left. I kept my voice even, no performance in it. So, you can step back, or you can keep standing there, but I'm not the one who's going to move. Nico. One word. From Luca. Nico stepped back. Luca looked at me. I'm not leaving the building. You have my word. Then I need 5 minutes with the wound before you do whatever you're about to do. He nodded once. The room rearranged itself. The other men moved. The man I didn't recognize stepped out, and it was just me and Luca, and the particular quiet of a room that had just been full of urgency. I checked the packing. Wound looked the same, fever still down. I worked quickly and didn't waste the quiet. The man who stepped toward me, I said. That was a threat. Yes, and you stopped it. Of course. I taped the fresh dressing into place and looked at him. I want you to understand why I'm saying this. In a lot of environments, especially environments built around power and hierarchy, letting someone lower in the chain intimidate someone who has less power is a management tool. You didn't do that. I paused. I noticed. It matters. He was quiet for a moment. He was out of line. No one threatens women in my house. Not just because I'm a woman. Because I'm a person. You stopped it because I'm a person who was doing nothing wrong and didn't deserve to be moved around like furniture. I held his gaze. That distinction is worth naming. Because most people don't make it. They say women when they mean people. The version that covers everyone is harder to practice and more important to get right. Something in his expression shifted, subtle, like a door opening an inch. He didn't respond directly, but he didn't look away either. Marco came back in 20 minutes later. He gave a short briefing. He did it in English. I don't know if that was deliberate or habit, but it meant I heard it. Alexei Volkov's people had tested the perimeter. Not a full incursion, a probe. They wanted to see how the estate responded when it wasn't operating at full strength. Someone had told them Luca was compromised. Somebody on the inside. Marco and Luca exchanged a look that had a whole conversation in it. It's Theo, I said. They both turned. I'm not guessing, I said. He came to my door tonight, and he couldn't hold still. Not nervous, like someone who'd done something wrong. Nervous, like someone waiting to find out if the worst thing is going to happen. I set down the tape I'd been holding. He's scared of something specific, something being held over him. Whoever turned him didn't buy him. They're holding something he can't walk away from. Marco looked at Luca. Luca's jaw was set. Bring him in. He's young, I said. Whatever you're planning to do, I'm going to talk to him. I held his gaze for a moment, decided to believe that. Okay. Theo came in the way people come in when they've already accepted the worst. Shoulders dropped, eyes on the floor, hands at his sides, because there was nothing to do with them. He was 24 years old, and he looked 17 standing there. Luca sat behind the desk. Marco stood by the window. I stayed near the door. Luca started in Italian, quiet, controlled. The kind of controlled that is more frightening than loud. Theo answered in English, like he was too scared to manage two languages at once. It's my mom. His voice cracked on the second word, and he pushed past it. Volkov's people have her. They took her 3 days ago. They said if I didn't tell them, when you were at low strength, they said they'd. He stopped. He couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. The room was very still. Then Nico moved, not fast, but toward Theo and with purpose, and I was between them before the thought was fully formed. Stop. Nico looked at me with something that was almost disbelief. This doesn't concern this man is shaking, I said. He gave information because someone is holding his mother hostage. He's not the threat in this room, he's the victim of one. And if you put your hands on someone who is not able to defend himself right now, I will document it, and Jade will have it by 8 tomorrow morning. Silence. I turned to Luca. He was watching me, not with surprise, with something quieter than that. She's right, he said. Nico turned. He gave them everything they needed to. He gave them information because someone took his mother. Luca's voice didn't rise. It went flatter, which was somehow more definitive. That is not the same thing as betrayal. Calling it betrayal is what people with power do when they want to avoid asking why someone had no better option. The room was quiet. I watched Luca. He wasn't performing this. He was working something out in real time, and the working out was visible in the particular way his eyes moved, not calculating, not managing, thinking. How old were you when you came to work for this family? He asked Theo. Theo blinked, like the question itself was unexpected. 17. Why? My dad had a debt. They said, your father said, it could be settled if I came to work for the organization. Theo's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't really understand what that meant. I thought it was like regular work. Luca was quiet for a long time. And you've been here 7 years, he said. Yes, sir. Another silence. This one different, heavier. Luca looked at Marco. Get his mother back. Send whoever you need tonight. Marco nodded and moved to the door. And Theo. Luca's voice was still even, still controlled. but something in it had shifted. You're not being punished for this. Go get some sleep. Theo looked up for the first time, like he'd misheard. Go, Luca said. After Theo left, the room settled into the particular quiet of something that had just been decided. Nico left without being asked to. I gathered my kit, didn't say anything for a moment. Sometimes things need a minute before you put words on them. You took in a 17-year-old boy to settle a debt, I said finally. Not accusatory, just naming it. My father did. And you continued the arrangement. He didn't answer. Because there wasn't a clean answer, and I think he knew I'd see through a dirty one. I'm not telling you how to feel about that, I said. I'm just saying that it happened. And Theo's been carrying it for 7 years. And tonight, he had no choice that wasn't going to cost him something. I looked at him. You did the right thing just now. That doesn't undo the years, but it's still the right thing. Both of those things are true at the same time. Luca stood at the window. Outside, the grounds had quieted. The floodlights were still on, but the men had settled back into their positions. Marco said something to me earlier, he said. He said Volkov knows you're here, that you're accessible, meaning he wants to use me against you. Yes, because you brought me into your house. Yes, I thought about that. About how a choice made at the end of a long shift, the choice to walk through a curtain, to do a job, to refuse $15,000 had somehow led to Stanley through the room at 3 in the morning. We deal with it in the morning, I said. You need sleep, and so do I. Claire, I turned. What you did tonight, he said. Standing in front of Theo, I did my job. That wasn't medical. No, I agreed. It wasn't. I picked up my bag. But some things are just right, regardless of whose job they are. I went back to the guest room and didn't sleep much. Day 3. His fever was down to 99.1. The wound looked better, less red at the edges. The inflammation starting to pull back. The antibiotic was doing its job. Medically, the picture was improving. I stood at the window of the guest room and looked at the grounds below and thought about what that meant. It meant I could go home soon, which meant this was almost over. I should have felt relieved. I noticed I didn't, and then I noticed that I'd noticed. And then I put it on a shelf and went to check on my patient. Marco found me in the hallway. He had the face of someone carrying a report they'd rather not be carrying. I'd learned his faces in 3 days, which said something about how much time we'd spent in the same spaces. Volkov has made contact, he said, formally. He's asking for a meeting with Luca within 48 hours, and if Luca doesn't show, then Volkov interprets the absence as an opportunity. He paused. There's a secondary element. Me, yes. He said it without dressing it up. I appreciated that. He knows you're here. He intends to use that as pressure. His position is that your presence in this house makes you relevant to the negotiation. I stood with that for a moment. Relevant to the negotiation. That's one way to say it. Who told him I was here? That's still being determined. I already had a feeling it wasn't Theo. Theo had given information under coercion about Luca's condition and the estate's defenses. This felt like something else, something more recent and more specific. I filed that thought and went to tell Luca what I thought needed to happen next. Luca wanted to handle Theo in the study. I was there when they brought him in. Theo came, in the same way he had the night before, contained, careful, the posture of someone waiting for the floor to give out. He was still wearing the same clothes. I don't think he'd slept. Nico was already in the room, standing at the side, not speaking. Luca spoke first in English this time. Sit down, Theo. Theo sat. I want to understand what happened, all of it, from the beginning. What came out was quiet and unsteady and completely coherent, which is often how truth sounds. 3 days ago, 2 men had approached Theo's mother at her apartment in Bridgeport. They hadn't hurt her. They'd just made it clear that she'd be staying with them until Theo made a phone call. The phone call was simple, just an update. Was Luca at the estate? Was he operating at full capacity? Were there any vulnerabilities in the rotation? Just a few questions, they'd said. Then she comes home. Theo had made the call. Luca was still listening. She's back home now, Marco said from the doorway. He'd been coordinating that since last night. Our people confirmed it an hour ago. Theo looked up. Something broke open in his face, and then he pulled it back together. Because he was in a room where he didn't feel safe enough to let it stay open, which itself said everything. Nico shifted, started to move. I stepped in front of Theo before I'd made a conscious decision to do it. No, I said. Nico stopped, looked at me with something between frustration and actual surprise, like I was a variable that kept appearing in places variables weren't supposed to appear. He cooperated under duress, I said. Someone took his mother and told him she'd be hurt if he didn't help them. That is not the same as choosing to betray someone. Calling it the same thing is how people with power avoid asking themselves why someone underneath them had no better option. I turned to Luca. He was watching me, not with the evaluating look from Bay 7. Something more open than that. He's 24 years old, I said. He came into this when he was 17 because his family had a debt. He didn't choose this life. He didn't choose to be in a position where the only way to protect his mother was to give information that put you at risk. I kept my voice steady. He's not the problem in this room. He's the result of one. The room was quiet. Nico said, "She doesn't understand how this." "I understand how it works," I said, turning. "I understand exactly how it works. Somebody at the top decides what the rules are, and everybody underneath pays when the rules get broken, regardless of why they broke them. I've seen that system my whole life. It's not justice. It's just power calling itself justice because it can." Silence. Then Luca said, "How old was your father when he first came to work for this family?" Marco answered from the doorway. 42. He owed money from a failed business. He ran errands for 3 years, paid off the debt, and left. And Theo's father, different, deeper debt, different terms. And when Theo's father couldn't pay, we took his son at 17. Nobody answered that, because there wasn't an answer that made it better. Luca stood, walked to the window, looked out at the grounds. "Get him out of this room," he said. "Give him somewhere to sleep, and nobody touches him." He said the last part toward Nico without looking at Nico. It landed exactly where it was meant to land. Later, just Luca and me and Marco for a few minutes before he left to handle the next thing on the list of things that needed handling. Marco delivered one more piece of information before he went. Volkov had called. He'd heard that Theo had been released without punishment. He read it as weakness. "Montano is letting a woman make his decisions," Marco quoted, flatly, like he was reading a weather report. "He wants to meet the woman." After Marco left, Luca looked at me. "You are now Volkov's primary interest," he said. "I was Volkov's primary interest before you got off the phone." He almost smiled at that. "Almost. The clinic where my father's money went," he said. "The one where your mother volunteered. There are others like it. 3 free clinics, 3 elementary schools, a program for people coming out of prison." He said it to the window. "No one knows they come from me. I've kept it that way for 8 years." I sat down on the edge of the chair near the wall. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Rosa told you who my father was last night, and I'd rather you hear the rest from me than piece it together from something you half heard." "Okay," I said. "Go ahead. The money I fund those organizations with is not clean money. It comes from the ports, from the distribution agreements, from the parts of my operation that I don't invite scrutiny toward." He turned from the window. "I know that. I've always known that. And I've told myself that the outcome justifies the source." I was quiet for a moment. "Does it?" he asked. And here's the thing about that question. He was actually asking, not looking for reassurance, not looking for absolution. He wanted a real answer, and he was willing to hear it be uncomfortable. That's rarer than people think. "I can't tell you it justifies the source," I said. "Because if I do that, then the logic works in reverse. If good outcomes justify dirty money, then dirty money can always find a good outcome to hide behind. That's how the cycle keeps going." I looked at him. "But I can tell you this. The schools are real. The clinics are real. The families those places have helped. That's real, regardless of where the money came from." I paused. "Both of those things are true at the same time. The good doesn't cancel the bad. The bad doesn't erase the good. They both exist. And the only honest place to stand is somewhere that holds both of them without flinching." He looked at me for a long time. My brother would have said something like that. It was the first time he'd mentioned a brother. I didn't push on it. "Some things open on their own timeline." "He sounds like he was worth knowing," I said. He was. He sat down across from me, not behind the desk, just in the other chair, like a regular person. "He died when I was 15. And I've been running this organization ever since, because there was no one else to do it." "Did you choose it?" "I inherited it." "That's not the same as choosing." "No," he said. "It's not." We sat with that for a minute. The estate was quiet around us. Outside the window, the sun was going down over the lake, throwing long shadows across the water. There's a woman named Diane, I said. She runs a nonprofit on the south side. Transition programs for people leaving incarceration. I've sent families to her. She's good at what she does. Why are you Digseem, sis? Because Theo asked me this morning if he could ever get out, I said. Not run, not disappear. Out. With permission, with safety, with some kind of future on the other side. Luca was still. I told him I'd mention it, I said. That's all I'm doing, mentioning it. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then he came here at 17. Yes, he didn't choose this. No, another long pause. I'll think about it, he said. In my experience, I'll think about it from someone who actually means it sounds different. I'll think about it from someone who's closing a door. Politely. This one sounded like he meant it. Rosa called us for dinner 20 minutes later. She set 4 plates at the kitchen table without asking anyone, and nobody refused to sit down. Marco talked about the estate when he was a boy, when his mother first came to cook for the Montano family, and he would run through the gardens and get yelled at in 2 languages. Luca listened more than he spoke. It was the most normal 2 hours the house had probably seen in a long time. After dinner, Luca stood at the window again. The lake was dark now, just the moon on the water. The schools I fund, he said. I drive past sometimes. I've never gone in. Why not? He took a moment. I didn't think I was allowed to. Allowed by who? He didn't answer that, but I could see him, sitting with the question. Some questions do more work when they're left open. I went to check his vitals before bed. Temperature 98.9, almost normal. His body was healing. The other part was slower, but it was moving. Day 4. I counted them from the second-floor hallway window while the coffee was brewing downstairs. I got to 47 before I stopped counting and just looked. Men stationed at measured intervals along the fence line. 2 on the roof of the east wing. A cluster of 3 at the tree line near the lake. More moving between positions in a rotation that had clearly been choreographed ahead of time. 200, Marco had said the night before. I'd thought that was an approximation. I didn't think that anymore. I stood at that window for a while, with my arms crossed and my coffee getting cold in my hand. 47 visible from one window on one side of the house, and Volkov had people positioned in a 2-kilometer ring outside the perimeter. That was what Marco had told Luca the night before. Quietly, in the doorway, thinking I was asleep. I wasn't asleep. I'd been lying in the dark thinking about Theo's face, when he said it's my mom. About the way the word cracked down the middle of him, and he kept talking anyway. About what it costs a person to hold themselves together in a room where they don't feel safe enough to fall apart. I knew that cost. I'd been paying versions of it my whole life. My phone buzzed at exactly 8 o'clock. Jade. I answered on the second ring, and her face filled the screen, and something in my chest that had been clenched since Tuesday night loosened a fraction. She looked tired. She was in the break room, coffee in hand, the familiar worn edge of the Saint Emmanuel linoleum visible behind her. Normal. Actual normal. You look like you haven't slept, she said. Which was her version of I was worried about you. I've slept. Just not much. I moved to the window so she could see outside. I'm okay. She looked at what was behind me. Processed it. Claire. That's a lot of men with guns. I know. Who are these people? Long story. I'll tell you everything when I'm home. I kept my voice steady. I just need you to know I'm okay, and I know where I am, and I'm not being held against my will. A pause. Are you sure about that last part? Yes. I meant it. Luca had honored every condition I'd set. That wasn't nothing. Jade, if I don't call you tomorrow morning at 8, give that address to the police. Don't text me first. Don't wait to see if I check in. Just call. Okay, and I love you. I love you too. And when you get back, you are going to sit down and tell me every single thing that happened. Deal. I closed the laptop. Luca was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. He was in a dark sweater, cleaner and more rested looking than yesterday, which meant the antibiotics were working. He was watching me with an expression that was hard to read. You gave her the address again, he said. I gave her the address every morning I've been here. I set the laptop on the chair beside me. That's not going to change. I know. He leaned against the doorframe. I'm not asking you to change it. Okay, I want you to understand something. He said it carefully. not defensively. The men outside, they're not there to keep you in. You're not a prisoner. You've never been a prisoner. I know that. I looked at him. But I also know that a person can be in a dangerous situation without being imprisoned. Those aren't mutually exclusive. So I keep Jade informed. Because that's how I make sure I stay a person with agency in this house, instead of just becoming part of the furniture. He nodded. Slowly. Like he was actually sitting with it, rather than just acknowledging it. Fair. Also, I said it protects you. If something happens to me here, Jade has the address. That's a reason for you to make sure something doesn't happen to me here. He looked at me for a moment. You worked that out before you gave her the address the first time. Of course I did. He almost smiled. Come downstairs. Marco needs to talk to us both. Volkov had sent an envoy, not a message. An actual person, a man named Petrov, 40s, the specific kind of well-dressed that was designed to suggest power without declaring it. He was in the formal sitting room when Marco walked us down. Seated, like he'd been waiting long enough to stop minding the wait. Luca let me stand near the doorway. He didn't ask me to leave, and he didn't ask me to come further in. It was my choice where to position myself, and I positioned myself where I could hear everything. The meeting was short. Petrov laid out Volkov's terms in the organized, effectless way of someone who had delivered terms many times before. Territory questions first, the southern port corridor, a distribution route Volkov wanted access to, some renegotiation of boundaries that had apparently been a point of friction for over a year. Standard, expected, nothing surprising. Then the third item. Mr. Volkov requires a gesture of good faith, specifically, the removal of the external variable currently residing on the premises, the woman, handed over to Mr. Volkov's representatives. This demonstrates that Mr. Montano's judgment remains his own and has not been compromised by outside influence. He said it the way you'd say, please initial here, like it was a formality. I kept my face neutral. I was getting good at that. Luca didn't look at me. He looked at Petrov. No, he said. Petrov didn't react. Mr. Volkov anticipated some hesitation. He's prepared to offer. The answer isn't hesitation, Luca said. It's no. To the first presentation and every subsequent presentation. You can go back and tell him I said so. He'll interpret that as a sign of weakness, as evidence that your judgment has been. He can interpret it however he wants. Luca's voice was completely even. No heat in it, no performance. Just a man saying a true thing and not needing it to be dramatic. My answer is still no. Petrov left. I waited until we were back in the hallway. You just gave up a significant negotiation advantage, I said. Yes. Because of me. No, he said it firmly. Not as a correction, as a clarification. Because they were asking me to hand over a person, not a resource, not a territory. A person who has done nothing except be good at her job and get pulled into something she didn't ask to be part of. He paused. I don't do that. I looked at him. Why not? A lot of people in your position would. It would have been pragmatic. A lot of people in my position would, he agreed. I've met most of them. I've watched what happens to them over time. He started walking down the hallway. When you start treating people like variables in an equation, when you stop seeing them as people and start seeing them as leverage, as assets, as obstacles, you don't just change how you do business. You change what you are. I fell into step beside him. You sound like you've thought about this before. I have. He stopped at the window at the end of the hall. I watched my father do it. Make the pragmatic choice. Every time. Because the outcome justified it. He was very good at justifying outcomes. He looked out at the lake. He justified a lot. And you haven't. A long pause. I've justified things I shouldn't have. But I haven't, he stopped. Found the right words. There are some lines you cross, and you can see yourself crossing them. And you can still turn around. And there are some lines you cross, and something changes that doesn't change back. Handing me over would have been one of those. Yes. He said it simply, because you are a person, not a piece on a board. And the moment I treat you like one, I've stopped seeing people as people entirely. And after that, he let it hang. After that, it's just a matter of time before everything becomes a transaction. I stayed quiet for a moment. Then, the right reason to not hand me over is that I'm a person, and people are not objects for exchange. Not because of what it would mean for your moral accounting. He looked at me. The distinction matters, I said. Your soul isn't the center of it. I am. When the reason is about me, about the fact that I have inherent dignity that doesn't belong to either of us to barter with, that's the right reason. When it's about what it says about you, you've still made it about you. He stared at me for a long moment, then, you're right. I know. You're also relentless. I know that, too. I found Theo after lunch. He was sitting in the kitchen garden, a small, walled area off the back of the house where roses grew herbs, just sitting on the bench, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. I sat down beside him without asking. We were quiet for a minute. The garden smelled like rosemary and turned earth, and the faint, cold edge of the lake somewhere behind the walls. My mom used to have a garden, he said. Not to me specifically, just to the air. What did she grow? Tomatoes, mostly. She said anything else was too much work. A small sound, almost a laugh. She was right. I let that breathe for a moment. Then, she's home. She's okay, I know. He nodded at the ground. Marco told me. He rubbed the back of his neck. I keep thinking about what would have happened if they hadn't brought her back. If Luca had decided not to, he did bring her back. This time, he looked up, brown eyes, tired. But I'm still here. I'm still part of this. And the next time someone wants to get to him, the next time someone needs a pressure point, I'm right here. I'll always be right here. Do you want out? I asked. Directly, not running, not hiding. Actually out. He was quiet for a long moment. Like the question itself was something he'd kept in a locked room and wasn't sure how to open. Yes, he said. I've wanted out since I was 19. He shook his head. But I don't know if that's something that happens for people like me. I know someone who runs a program, I said. Legitimate. Legal. She works with people who need to rebuild from nothing, job placement, housing assistance, counseling if you want it, legal support for anything that needs untangling. She's been doing it for 12 years. He looked at me. Why would you? You don't owe me anything. I'm not doing it because I owe you something. I'm doing it because you're a person who's been stuck in a corner since you were 17 years old, and the fact that the corner has nice furniture doesn't make it less of a corner. I looked at him steadily. You deserve a different kind of life if you want it. That's not earned. It's just true. His eyes went red at the edges. He looked back at the ground. Luca would never. I'm going to ask him, I said. That's all. Just ask. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then quietly, okay. That evening, Rosa served dinner in the kitchen again. No one had asked her to. She just did it. 4 plates, the good bread, something that had been simmering since noon. Marco sat at the end, Luca across from me, Rosa at the stove, and then at the table when she was ready, which is how she operated on her own timeline, in her own kitchen, and everyone else was a guest in it. Partway through dinner, Luca said to Marco, "How old were you when you first came to work here?" Marco looked up, slightly surprised. 19. Your mother was already here. She'd been here 3 years. She brought me in when I was old enough. He broke off a piece of bread. I wanted to be a mechanic. Did I ever tell you that? No cars. I was very good with cars. A small shrug. My mother needed the income. This paid better than the garage, so. He left the rest of it unfinished. Luca was quiet. Did you regret it? He asked. Sometimes. Marco said it easily, without drama. And sometimes not. That's most things, in my experience. Rosa's made a small sound of agreement. After dinner, Luca found me in the hallway. I've been thinking about what you said about Theo, he said. I figured you would be. There are complications, practical ones. He knows things. I know. And there's the question of what kind of precedent. I'm not asking you to set a precedent, I said. I'm asking you to make a decision about one specific person who came to you at 17 because his family had a debt, who didn't choose this, who has been here for 7 years and is 24 years old. I looked at him, just this one. That's all I'm asking. He looked at me for a long time. I'll talk to him tomorrow, he said. I nodded. That's enough. Outside the window, the 200 men were still there, still holding the perimeter, still watching the dark. But the house felt different tonight, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the noise. Day 5. I was showing Theo how to change the packing on Luca's wound because he needed to know how to do it. And because giving Theo a task he could do well was something I'd learned to value when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Jade, but not the scheduled call. It was 10 in the morning. That wasn't right. I picked it up. Call me when you can. It's not an emergency, but it's not nothing. The clinic in back of the yards. I looked at Theo. Finish up. Keep the pressure even on the tape so the edges don't lift. I stepped out into the hallway, called Jade back. She answered before it finished ringing. So there was an incident last night at the free clinic on Justine Street. Someone broke in, not a robbery. Nothing was taken, but they trashed the supply room, overturned the medication cabinet, broke the exam table, wrote something on the wall. A pause. Nobody was hurt. The clinic director came in at 7 this morning and found it. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. What did they write? Jade hesitated. Something in Russian. The director photographed it, sent it to the police. They haven't translated it officially, but her neighbor, she said it means something like, "Consider this a message." Okay, Claire, I'm okay. I'll call you back. I hung up. I stood in the hallway for a moment, just stood there. That clinic served 200 families every week. I knew that because I'd volunteered there on Tuesday afternoons for 2 years. I knew the director, a woman named Patricia, who had been running that clinic on a skeleton budget for 16 years and had never once talked about quitting. I knew the exam table they'd broken because I'd used it to check a 7-year-old girl's ears 6 weeks ago. I walked downstairs and found Luca in his study. I set my phone on his desk. The photos Jade had forwarded were on the screen. The overturned cabinet, the broken equipment, the words on the wall that I couldn't read but understood the meaning of perfectly well. That clinic serves 200 families a week, I said. My voice was steady. I was working to keep it that way because the alternative was something I didn't have room for right now. Children. Elderly people. People who don't have insurance and can't afford to wait until something small becomes something serious. And it was attacked last night because my name got connected to yours. Claire, no. I kept going. Not loud, just clear. I need to say this plainly. A place that exists to help people who have very little got hurt because I treated a patient at 2 in the morning and I refused to look away. I looked at him. I'm not blaming you for that. I'm not saying I made the wrong choice. I'm that the cost of this is landing on people who had nothing to do with it. And I need you to understand that's what's happening. Luca stood. I will restore that clinic, he said. Everything that was damaged. I'll have people there today. That's not, I know money isn't the whole answer. He said it before I could. But it's the first part of it, and I will do the first part. Today. He looked at me steadily. What else do you need? I sat down in the chair across from his desk. Not because I was tired. Because the question, what do you need, had caught me off guard in a way that I needed a second to process. People didn't ask me that very often. I was usually the one asking it. I need it to actually be fixed, I said. Not covered up. Fixed. New equipment, restocked supplies, and Patricia, the director, she needs to know this won't happen again. She'll have that guarantee. From who? Because a guarantee from someone she doesn't know means nothing. It needs to come from somewhere with weight behind it. He nodded. I'll handle it personally. I looked at him. She doesn't know who you are, and she can't know. Because if she finds out that clinic is attached to your name, she won't take the money. You understand that. Something moved across his face. Not offense. Recognition. Yes, he said quietly. I understand that. We sat with that for a moment. Then Marco came in. He sat down like a man who had been waiting to have a conversation for a long time and had finally decided to have it. He looked at me first, then at Luca. There's something you both should know, he said. Then he told me about the rest of it. The 3 free clinics, the 3 elementary schools, the re-entry program for people coming out of Cook County Jail job training, housing treatment, legal assistance, 8 years of funding, flowing through a shell foundation with no name attached to it that anyone outside this house would recognize. $4 million a year, anonymous, continuous, quiet. I let him finish. Luca was watching the window, not avoiding me, just giving me room to sit with it before I responded. I took that room. $4 million a year for 8 years. $32 million total. Moving from an organization built on illegal port operations and distribution networks into schools and clinics and programs designed to put people back on their feet, and not a single person on the receiving end knew where it came from. The clinic on Justine Street, I said. That's one of yours. Yes, Marco said. The elementary school on Paulina, the one that got the new computer lab 2 years ago. Anonymous donor. Yes, I thought about my mother, standing in a supply room 20 years ago, stacking donated medications that had been bought with money she knew nothing about from a source she would never have chosen if she'd known. I thought about all the things that exist in the world that are genuinely good and genuinely complicated at the same time. Why anonymous? I asked. Luca turned from the window. Because if the people receiving it knew where it came from, they wouldn't take it. They'd be right not to. And because you know the money isn't clean. Both. I was quiet for a long time. Longer than usual. Because this was the kind of thing that deserved the full weight of thinking rather than a quick answer dressed up as a considered one. Luca waited. He was getting better at that, at not filling silence with something that wasn't ready to be said. I can't tell you the good cancels the bad, I said finally. I'm not going to do that, because once that logic works, it works in every direction. Dirty money can always find a good cause to launder its conscience through. That's not an argument I'm willing to make. I looked at him. But I can hold both things at the same time. The clinic is real. The kids in that computer lab are real. The man who got a job last year through your re-entry program and is now paying rent and calling his kids on the weekends, that's real. None of that disappears because of where the money came from. So, what does that mean? He asked, not defensively. Genuinely. It means the good is genuinely good, and the bad is genuinely bad. And they don't cancel each other out, they both exist, fully, at the same time. And the only honest place to stand is somewhere that holds both without using one to escape the other. I held his gaze. Using the good to forgive the bad is how people avoid changing, and using the bad to dismiss the good is how people avoid hope. Neither one gets you anywhere real. The room was quiet. Marco stood up, put his hand briefly on Luca's shoulder as he passed a small gesture, old and without ceremony, and left without saying anything. It was just the two of us. He took me to a wing of the estate I hadn't seen, older than the rest of the house, different wood, different light. The feeling of a place that had been preserved rather than lived in. He unlocked a heavy door with a key from his pocket and pushed it open, and we walked into his father's study. It was exactly as it must have been the day Antonio Montano died. The same dust on the same surfaces. A desk in the center, cleared of everything except a silver letter opener and a single framed photograph. Heavy drapes on the windows. Books on the walls that had been read and replaced, at angles that said they'd been read more than once. Luca picked up the photograph and handed it to me. A family. A man in his 50s with the same gray eyes. A woman beside him, elegant and a little tired, hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage boy. And next to her, another boy older, taller, with a quiet confidence in the way he stood. Enzo, Luca said. My brother. He was 18 there. I was 15. He looks like someone worth knowing. He was. Luca moved to the window. The lake was visible through the gap in the drapes. He was everything this family was supposed to be. Smart enough to negotiate his way out of anything. Hated violence. Hated what the organization did. He was quiet. He was going to change it. That was the plan. He was going to take over when my father stepped back, and he was going to reshape it into something legitimate. What happened? My father gave an order. A specific operation. I won't tell you the details, but it was the kind of thing Enzo had always refused to touch. And my father expected him to follow it anyway, because he was the heir and because that's how it worked. And Enzo said no. Enzo says no. Luca said it slowly, like the words had a weight he was used to carrying. And my father's people, not enemies, not rivals, his own people, interpreted that refusal as a threat to the organization. And they acted on it. I held the photograph carefully. The woman in it was smiling at something outside the frame. She didn't know. Your father ordered it. He never admitted it. He explained it. There's a difference, and he understood that difference perfectly. Luca turned from the window. That was the second lesson I learned about power. The first was that Enzo was gone. The second was that the people with power don't take responsibility for what they cause. They explain it. They contextualize it. They find the logic that makes it make sense, and they offer you that logic instead of an apology. And then you took over. There was no one else. My father was deteriorating. The organization needed someone. I was 15, and I knew how to be angry, and I had just watched my brother die for refusing to bend. He looked at the photograph in my hands, so I bent. I told myself I was surviving. And then I told myself I was protecting what was left. And then, enough years passed that I stopped having a conversation with myself about it at all, until now. Until you walked into Bay 7 and told me I was a regular person. I set the photograph down on the desk, gently. You've been honoring Enzo for 23 years by becoming the person he died refusing to be, I said. That's not a tribute. That's a contradiction. He looked at me. I know. Do you? I've known for a while. I just didn't have a name for it. He looked at his brother's face in the photograph. He would have hated me. That's the honest version. He would have been sad about it, and underneath the sadness, he would have been furious, and he would have been right. Then what do you do with that? I don't know yet. That's okay. I meant it. Not knowing and admitting you don't know is further than most people get. We stood in the old room for a while. The dust, the letter opener, the photograph of a family that didn't know what was coming. He asked me once, Luca said. Enzo. He asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was 11. I said I wanted to run the docks like my father. A pause. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, that's not a dream. That's just where you already live. I looked at him. Smart kid. Very. He was right. Yes. He looked at the window. He usually was. I thought about Theo in the garden. About a 24-year-old man who had been living somewhere he didn't choose since he was 17. About the question of whether where you already live could ever become a choice instead of just a fact. Theo's waiting for you to talk to him, I said. Not pushing. Just placing it back in the room where it belonged. Luca nodded. Tomorrow. Okay, Claire. He said my name and then paused, like he was deciding whether to say the next part. Whatever I decide about Theo, about any of this, it isn't, because I want you to think better of me. I looked at him. I know. Does it matter? Whether the reason is good? Yes, I said. But that's a conversation for when you know what you're going to do. I moved toward the door. Get some sleep. Your temperature was normal this morning for the first time. That's worth not wrecking. I left him standing in his father's study. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall for a moment with my eyes closed. 23 years, a 15-year-old boy, and a dead brother and a father who explained instead of apologized, and a system that was handed to him, without a door out, the same way it had been handed to Theo 7 years ago, just with nicer furniture and higher stakes. I thought about the photograph, the woman's hand on Luca's shoulder, the way Enzo stood. Some things get buried so deep that by the time you find them, you've forgotten they were ever there. But they were always there. That's the thing about buried things. They don't go away. They just wait. Day 6 started with Jade calling 40 minutes before she was supposed to. That's never good. I picked up and she was already talking. Don't panic. But the hospital got contacted this morning by state licensing board. Someone filed a complaint anonymous saying a St. Emmanuel nurse was practicing outside her license at a private residence connected to organized crime. A breath. They want to know where you are. They want a statement. I sat on the edge of the bed, thought for exactly 10 seconds. I'm calling my lawyer, I said. Don't say anything to anyone until I do. Claire, I'm okay. This is manageable. I'll call you back. I hung up and called my attorney. A woman named Deborah, who I'd met 3 years ago when a patient's family tried to sue the hospital, and I got pulled into it. She was sharp and unhurried, and she picked up on the third ring like she'd been expecting to hear from me eventually. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Don't go anywhere. I'll make a few calls and get back to you within the hour." I thanked her and hung up. Luca was in the doorway. "I have people who could, my lawyer," I said. "Not yours." He stopped. "I'm not being difficult," I said. "I'm being clear. My professional license, my legal situation, those are mine. I don't let them get tangled up with yours. That's not a negotiation. It's a boundary." He nodded. One clean nod. No argument. I went downstairs to wait for Deborah to call back. Marco found me in the kitchen. He sat down across from me with his coffee, and he didn't say anything for a moment, just sat. Which was something I'd learned about Marco. He didn't fill quiet with noise. He waited until he had something worth saying. "Volkov filed that complaint," he said. "We confirmed it 20 minutes ago. His people found a way to access the filing system anonymously. It's his move. He can't get through the perimeter, so he's going around it. He's trying to force me to leave on my own." Yes. Smart. I didn't say it admiringly, just accurately. Marco turned his coffee cup in his hands. Can I say something? Sure. In 41 years with this family, I've watched a lot of people come through that door. He nodded toward the main entrance. Staff, associates, people who wanted something from Luca's father, then from Luca. People who were afraid. People who were performing not being afraid. He looked at me. You're the first person who came in here and immediately made sure you had a way out that didn't depend on anyone in this house. I waited. Most people who end up around men like Luca, he said, they either fold or they try to use the situation. You did neither. You just kept being yourself. He paused. That's rarer than it sounds. It shouldn't be rare, I said. No, but it is. Deborah called back before I could respond. The complaint was real but procedurally weak. No evidence, no witness statements. Nothing that would hold up under basic scrutiny. She was filing a response that afternoon. My license was not at immediate risk. Stay available. She said, don't do anything unusual. She'd handle it. I thanked her and sat back. Marco was still across from me. Okay, I said. Nico came to Luca in the afternoon and confessed. I wasn't in the room. But the house is old, and the walls are thick, and certain conversations still carry. What he'd done was this. 3 days ago. Before Volkov's envoy had even arrived. Nico had made his own contact. Quietly, through an intermediary. With Volkov's people. His offer was simple. Claire Hayes handed over without resistance in exchange for a guarantee that the southern port routes stayed untouched. He'd done it without telling Luca. He'd done it because he believed it was the practical solution, the efficient solution, the solution that protected what actually mattered. I found out when Luca came to find me and told me himself, standing in the hallway, directly, without softening a single part of it. I wanted you to hear it from me, he said. I stood with it for a moment. The particular feeling of learning that someone had decided, in a room you weren't in, that you were available to be traded. It's not a new feeling. Different rooms, different forms. But the core of it is always the same, the discovery that someone looked at you and saw a unit of exchange rather than a person. What did you do? I asked. I removed him from the property. Permanently. Yes. I nodded. Thank you for telling me. You're not, he started. I'm angry, I said, but not at you. You didn't do it, and you told me the truth about it. Instead of managing it quietly, and hoping I'd never find out, I looked at him. Those things matter. Both of them. He thought he was protecting the organization. I know what he thought he was doing. I kept my voice even. People who treat other people as objects to be moved around usually have a reason they believe in. That doesn't change what it is. He looked at me and saw a problem to be solved, not a person to be considered. And the moment you start doing that, the moment any of us start doing, that we've lost something that doesn't come back easily. Luca was quiet. The right thing isn't always the efficient thing, I said. And when efficiency becomes the only value, people stop being people and start being variables. That's not a world I'm willing to accept. Not out there, not in here. That night, I fell apart a little. Not dramatically. Just the accumulated weight of 6 days. Found the one moment I wasn't paying attention and sat down on my chest. I was on the floor of the guest room, back against the bed, when Rosa came in. She didn't knock. She just opened the door and looked at me, and sat down on the floor beside me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. We were quiet for a long time. You hold everything, she said eventually. Somebody has to. Why does it have to be you? I didn't answer right away, because the answer was old and a little embarrassing and more honest than I usually let myself be. Because I learned early that if I didn't hold things, they fell, I said. My dad died when I was 12 and my mom worked 3 nights a week and things needed to be held. So I held them. Rosa didn't say I'm sorry or that must have been hard. She just nodded, like someone who understands what it cost and doesn't need to perform sympathy about it. You can put it down sometimes, she said. It doesn't mean you're dropping it. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I know. Knowing and doing are different. I know that too. She made a small sound, almost a laugh. She put her hand over mine on the floor and left it there. We sat like that for a while. Just 2 people on the floor of a room in a house surrounded by 200 armed men. in the middle of something neither of us had planned, holding the particular quiet of a moment that doesn't need anything added to it. In the morning, there was a cup of coffee on my nightstand, still hot, no note, I knew who'd put it there. Day 7. Luka called Volkov himself. No intermediary, no strategy meeting beforehand. He picked up the phone, dialed the number, and proposed a public meeting. Neutral ground, a restaurant downtown, midday, just the two of them. Marco stood in the doorway and watched him make the call with the expression of a man witnessing something he'd given up expecting. When Luca hung up, Marco said, "You're sure?" "No." Luca set the phone down. "But I'm sure that every other approach I know how to make isn't something I want to keep being good at." He found me before he left. I was in the guest room repacking my medical bag. The wound had been clean that morning, healing well. No sign of infection. The kind of steady progress that meant the work was done. We both knew what that meant. "You're almost ready to go home," he said. "After today, yes." He stood in the doorway. "Not coming in, not leaving. I want you to know why I'm doing this. You don't owe me an explanation. I want to give one." He looked at the bag in my hands. "You asked me once what I'd choose if I had a real choice. I've been thinking about it since you said it, and what I came back to every time is this. I don't know who I want to be yet, but I know who I don't want to be anymore. And that's somewhere." I set the bag down. "It is. Is it enough? I don't know. But it's honest. And honest is the only place you can actually build something from." He nodded once. "When I come back, we'll talk when you come back." He left. The restaurant was called La Paloma. Public. Lunch crowd. A corner table that Luca had reserved specifically because it was visible from the street. No shadows. No private rooms. Volkov came with 2 bodyguards. He'd agreed to come alone. He brought 2 bodyguards anyway. Luca let it go. What happened over the next 90 minutes? I know from what Marco told me afterward. Standing in the kitchen with his coffee while Rosa pretended not to listen from the stove. Luca put a real offer on the table. Not a threat, an actual offer. He would cede a portion of the Southern Port Corridor, valuable territory. The kind of concession that would have been unthinkable a week ago, in exchange for one condition, non-negotiable, written into the agreement as a hard clause, permanent, guaranteed protection of 5 civic organizations operating on Chicago's South Side. The clinic, the schools, the re-entry program. Not money, not borders, people. Volkov had looked at him for a long time. "That woman changed you," Volkov said. "No," Lucas said. "She showed me something I already knew and had been refusing to look at." "That's weak." "Maybe. Or maybe it's just what it looks like when someone stops pretending that power is the same thing as being right." Volkov didn't sign anything that afternoon. But before he stood to leave, he said something that Marco hadn't expected to hear. "My son is 11 years old," Volkov said. "Last week he asked me what I do." Luca didn't respond. "I'll think about your terms," Volkov said, and left. While Luca was at La Paloma, I sat with Theo in the garden. He already knew something was shifting. He could feel it in the house, the way you can feel a change in weather before it arrives. "I called the organization this morning," I told him. "The one I mentioned. They have a spot in their next intake cycle. Job placement assistance, transitional housing, legal support for anything that needs untangling." I looked at him. "Lucas said he'd talk to you when he gets back." Theo stared at the rosemary bushes. "What if he changes his mind? Then we deal with that." "But he won't." I paused. "He's not changing his mind to make me happy. He's doing it because he looked at you and saw what actually happened to a 17-year-old kid who got handed a life he didn't choose, and he can't unsee it now." "Is that enough reason?" "It's the right reason," I said. "That's better than enough." Theo turned the idea over. You could see him doing it. 17 to 24/7 years, and the first real door that had ever appeared in front of him. "I don't know who I am outside of this," he said quietly. "I know." I let that sit for a moment. "Neither does Luca. You've got something in common." He almost smiled. Luca came back at 4 o'clock. No fanfare. He walked in, set his keys on the hall table, and found me in the kitchen with Rosa and Marco. "Provisional agreement," he said. "Volkov's people will confirm the written terms by Friday." Marco exhaled one long, controlled breath that said everything about how much he'd been holding. "The clinic," I asked. "Restoration begins tomorrow morning. New equipment, full restocking, structural repairs if there are any." He looked at me directly. "Under a legitimate foundation this time. Patricia will know the funding is stable, and she'll have a name she can actually research. She'll ask questions. She should ask questions. He sat down at the table. I should be able to answer them. Rosa put a plate of food in front of him without asking. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. Crazy Rosa. She waved him off like he'd said something obvious, but I saw her face. After dinner, Luca found me in the hallway. Theo's waiting, I said. I know. He paused. I know what I'm going to say. Okay? It's not because of you. I know it's not. I mean, you're the reason I started looking at it, but the decision is mine. He held my gaze. The reason has to be that it's right. Not that it makes you think better of me. Not that it earns something. He paused. People deserve to have choices. Not because someone external decides to give them choices. Because they're people. That's the whole reason. It has to be enough on its own. I looked at him. That's it, I said quietly. That's exactly it. He went to find Theo. The conversation with Theo was short, 20 minutes, maybe less. I was downstairs when it happened. I didn't need to be there. When Theo came down, his eyes were red at the edges, and his shoulders had dropped in a way that looked like a man putting down something he'd been carrying since he was 17 years old. He walked through the kitchen without saying anything and went out to the garden. I let him go. Luca came down a few minutes later and sat across from me at the kitchen table. He cried, Luca said, like it surprised him. Of course he did. I don't. He stopped. Try it again. I didn't know what to do with that. You didn't have to do anything with it, I said. You just had to let him. He was quiet for a moment. I told him that people in a position of power have a responsibility. That power is supposed to create options for people who don't have it, not take options away. He looked at his hands. I told him I'd been doing the second thing, that this was me trying to do the first. How did he take that? He said, thank you. I didn't know what to say back. You don't have to say anything back to thank you, I said. That's the whole point of it. I packed my bag after breakfast. It didn't take long. I'd arrived with what I could carry, and I was leaving with what I could carry. Rosa was in the kitchen when I came down. She'd made the bread, the real kind, the kind that had been rising since before I woke up. She cut 2 slices and handed me one without asking. We stood at the counter and ate. You'll come back, she said. Not a question. Maybe. I looked at her. The neighborhood I work in, St. Emmanuel. The clinics, it's not far from here. In miles, anyway. Far in other ways. Yes, I thought about how to say the next thing. Rosa. What my mother did at that clinic volunteering. Not knowing where the money came from, she did it because she thought it was the right thing. Regardless of everything else, that was real. Yes, Rosa said simply. It was. I can hold that and also hold the rest of it. I know you can. She looked at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has been watching people navigate difficult things for 40 years. That's why you're still standing. I hugged her. She hugged back, like someone who didn't do it lightly and meant every second of it. Marco brought the car around. Luca was at the front door. I stopped in front of him. No ceremony. No script. Just 2 people at the end of something that had taken a shape neither of us had planned. What are you going to do next? I asked. He thought about it. Actually thought about it. I don't know yet. That's the first time that sentence has felt like a beginning instead of a problem. That's progress. You know where the clinic is, he said. I do. If I need medical attention, come in, I said. Same waiting room. Same line. Same as everyone else. I looked at him. If you want to understand what you've been funding all these years, that's where you start. Not from outside the window. From inside. With a number in your hand, sit next to the people those places are actually for. He nodded. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Morning shift. We stood there for a moment. The lake was visible past the tree line. The grounds were quieter than they'd been all week, fewer men. Lower tension. The specific relief of something that had been braced. Finally, being allowed to settle. You didn't decide who I was before you knew me, he said. I looked at him. Nobody should have to earn the basic assumptions that they're a person. That's not a reward for good behavior. It's just the starting point. I picked up my bag. Hold on to that. For yourself. And for everyone else who walks through your door. He didn't answer. But something as his face said he'd heard it in the place where things actually land. I got in the car. 3 months later, back of the Yard's free clinic. Tuesday, 9:04 a.m. The waiting room was full, the way it was always full. A man with a cough that had been going 2 weeks. An elderly woman who came every month for her blood pressure check and always brought Patricia a tin of cookies. Two kids with their grandmother. A teenager with a wrapped wrist who looked like he was hoping nobody would ask how it happened. I was showing a nursing student how to read a manual blood pressure cuff when the front door opened. I didn't look up right away. The cuff was at the tricky part, the point where students always lose the beat. Listen for the second thump, I said, not the first. The second one is the number you want. The student nodded, concentrating. I looked up. He was standing at the number dispenser near the door. Dark jeans, gray sweater, no entourage, no earpiece. Just a man who'd clearly found parking and walked in from the street like everyone else. He pulled a number, 14. He found an empty chair in the middle of the waiting room, not the corner, not near the door, the middle, next to the woman who came every month for her blood pressure check. She smiled at him with the open warmth of someone who'd been coming to this place long enough to feel at home in it. First time here. Yes, he said. It's good here. You'll be taken care of. He looked across the room, found me. I gave him the same nod I gave every patient when they arrived. You're here. Good. Wait your turn. He nodded back. I turned to my next patient. He waited for his name to be called. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locals is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
In the end, this story is not simply about a mafia boss, a nurse, or a dangerous world filled with power, enemies, and violence. It is a story about what happens when one person refuses to stop seeing others as human. Claire Hayes walks into Luca Montano's life as a nurse, but what she truly brings is something far more powerful than medicine. She brings truth. She reminds him that power does not make a man greater than others, and pain does not excuse him from responsibility. Through her courage, her boundaries, and her refusal to be bought, threatened, or used, Claire shows Luca that real strength is not control. Real strength is restraint. It is choosing not to trade a person for safety. It is choosing not to punish someone who was trapped. It is choosing to protect people who may never know your name. The greatest lesson of this story is that people are not pieces on a board. They are not leverage, not debts, not tools, and not sacrifices for someone else's ambition. Every person carries a life, a fear, a wound, and a hope that deserves to be recognized. Luca's transformation does not come because Claire saves him with romance, or because one good deed erases his past. It comes because he finally begins to look honestly at the world he inherited, the harm he allowed, and the choices still left in front of him. The story teaches us that redemption is not a speech, a donation, or a single heroic act. Redemption begins when a person stops explaining the damage and starts changing the system that caused it. Claire also teaches us the value of boundaries. Compassion does not mean surrendering yourself. Kindness does not mean becoming powerless. She helps Luca, but she never gives away her dignity, her freedom, or her voice. That is why her compassion is so strong. She proves that you can care deeply and still say no. You can stand beside someone without becoming their possession. You can enter a dangerous room and still remember who you are. And perhaps the most meaningful message is this: the good and the bad in life do not always cancel each other out. Sometimes they exist together, complicated and uncomfortable, but honesty is where change begins. By the end, when Luca sits in the clinic waiting room like everyone else, he is not magically forgiven. He is learning. He is beginning again. He is choosing to see people not from above, but beside them. For the audience, this story reminds us that dignity is not something people earn after proving they are worthy. It is the starting point. Everyone deserves to be treated as a person. Everyone deserves a choice. And sometimes, one brave voice can force even the most powerful man in the room to remember the truth he buried long ago. Power is not meant to take options away from people. It is meant to create them.